Now that you have a basic understanding of how a message gets from a source or a sender to a receiver, let's focus now on 3 different communication models and the differences amongst them, as well as some of the principles and misconceptions surrounding communication. The 3 basic models that you're likely to read about, and you may have different terminology for them depending upon the textbook or the instructor, are the linear, the interactive, and the transactional model. We'll start with the linear model of communication. That treats communication as one way. Communication is action or message transfer. I communicate to you, end of story. We used to think that television was this way, that television shows would come from the networks and it would stop with the audience and nothing would ever happen as a way to communicate back. Source encodes a message, sends it through a channel where it's decoded by a receiver, and depending upon which model you're looking at, it might include noise in there. But regardless, there's no feedback. You'll recognize this as the Berlo SMCR model. The interactive model, on the other hand, views communication as two-way. It is message exchange. So this takes into account the feedback loop by adding the second arrow on the bottom of it. So it includes feedback. In this model, it changed the word encodes to behaves to allow for both intentional and unintentional communication, added the concepts of noise, multiple channels, and took into account context. A third model came about, and they call that the transactional model. This model views communication as occurring simultaneously, that between you and me, or the participants in a communication event, you create a message and it affects the relationship. This is viewed by several as the most realistic. Now, you can really see the transactional model in play in, for example, a conversation. In a conversation, you are both a sender and receiver, but you are a sender and a receiver at exactly the same time. As you are talking to your friend is nodding, laughing, crying. So while you are a source of the message, you are also at exactly the same time the receiver of a message. That leads us to a revised definition of communication as a continuous transactional process involving participants operating within specific contexts where they create a relationship by simultaneously sending and receiving messages via channels, many of those messages being distorted by noise. So it involves creating a relationship. It's transactional in this case because it's talking about simultaneous sending and receiving messages, using channels plural rather than a single channel, and it takes into account context and noise. Let's talk about principles and misconceptions of communication, starting with 5 principles. The first is one that's pretty easy to understand, and that is that communication can be intentional or unintentional. That's pretty obvious. That's why we changed encodes to behaves, to take into account that we do not always intentionally send a message. And sometimes we try not to send a message. This is kind of a little scary if you think about it. It is impossible not to communicate, or you cannot not communicate, meaning that communication is inescapable. If you get spam in your email box, and you don't respond to that message because you don't want to let the sender know that it's a valid email address, then the very act of not sending a message is communicating that it's not a valid email address. You're communicating all the time. What you wear, your facial expressions, all of those communicate. You cannot not communicate. You can also consider that communication is irreversible. You can't take it back. Once it's out there, it's out there. It's like opening Pandora's box. Once you open the box and the demons come out, you can't take the demons and stuff them back into the box. Communication is also unrepeatable. You are watching this video right now and you're getting information this time. If you watch it again, it'll be a different communication event. A really obvious example is, let's say you go see a movie in a movie theater and you really, really liked the movie. You thought it was a really funny movie. So you get your friends to watch the movie, and this time you decide that you're going to do it at your house. It's the same movie, but now all of a sudden, instead of it being the really hilariously funny movie it was in the movie theater, you feel that it was kind of awkward. Perhaps some of it's offensive to you. The actors are saying their lines the same way, they're dressed the same way, but the communication event is different. It's unique. You cannot repeat the communication. And we've already alluded to this last one, that communication is contextual, meaning that it's governed by rules, that there are multiple rules in cultures, in environments. And again, you've manipulated this if you've ever chosen to break up with a romantic partner in a restaurant because you are under the assumption that given that context, that person is not likely to get upset, yell, and scream. Before I address the misconceptions of communication, let me remind you that each professor and each textbook covers this section differently. They may have different word choice, different axioms, but the underlying concepts are the same. We're going to talk about 5 myths, 5 things that people often believe about communication that are not true. The first has to do with meanings are in words. That's the concept that what you say is what you mean. Implies that if you don't say it, it doesn't get communicated. And that's not necessarily a good thing because that means that nonverbal messages do not exist. And we all know that that's not true. A second concern has to do with the fact that we are using words. Words are symbols for something else. And we all learn the meaning of the words. And so the meaning then is in people, not in the actual words that are being used. Additionally, it implies that once you've said something, you've communicated it. That as long as you put it into words, then the meaning has been communicated, which means that the sender or the source of a message is completely responsible for the effective communication, when in fact the receiver does have a lot to do with whether communication is effective or not. More is also communicated than just content, because it communicates about relationships, about status, whether you like the person or not. So meaning is definitely not in the words. We don't just communicate with words. A second misconception is some people believe that if some is good, more is better. And that's not true either. I'm sure there have been times that you wish you'd shut up talking a long time ago. More communication is not better. In fact, sometimes less is more, and at other times, not saying something is a whole lot better than saying something you might regret later. Some people believe that communication will solve all problems. In fact, a very famous quote is from the movie Cool Hand Luke that says, "What we have here is a failure to communicate," which implies that in order to communicate effectively and to get along well, we just have to understand each other. There are times that I can completely understand you and you can completely understand me, but we still disagree. Communication is not a panacea. It doesn't solve everything. Some people will say that communication is very simple. You know that's not the case. We've just talked about the model. You can see that it's endlessly complex. It's very complicated. In fact, Osmo Weo, a Scandinavian communication scholar, says, amongst other things, that if communication can fail, it will. And if a message can be understood in different ways, it will be understood in just the way that does the most harm. Communication is definitely not simple. The fifth myth is that as human beings, we were born with the ability to communicate, that we are just effective communicators. That's definitely not true. We can all improve our communication ability to become more effective communicators. It's grayed out because when it comes to whether we enjoy communication, our apprehension levels about communication, that may be rooted in our DNA as well as in other areas. It's a question of the nature or nurture, but we're not going to get into that right now because later in the semester we will cover this. So it's quiz time now. First, what differentiates the interactive model from the linear model of communication? There's several concepts in this one. When the term encodes was changed to behaved, which of the principles of communication was that to accommodate? And then finally, which principle or misconception of communication in this lecturette was a relatively new concept for you that you hadn't thought of before? Now that you have a better understanding of what communication is and the various elements in the model, you'll be able to adjust your communication to increase its effectiveness. Understanding what communication is and how it works is the first step to becoming a more effective communicator.